When the usher at Princeton University's graduation ceremony told me that my assigned seat was right here by the kitchen doors because family seating is full, she had no idea she was relegating the woman who had donated $15 million to build the very auditorium we were standing in, money that came with the understanding that the Walsh family would always have front-row seats at any university function, a promise that was now being broken in the most humiliating way possible. Before we dive into this story, let me know in the comments what the most disrespectful treatment you've ever received at a family event was, and if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happened next will absolutely shock you. Here's what Princeton University's event coordinator, the snooty usher, and even my own daughter-in-law Rebecca didn't know when they decided that 70-year-old Eleanor Walsh could be shuffled off to sit next to the catering staff while they reserved the prime seats for more important family members. I wasn't just some forgotten grandmother who could be dismissed and ignored. I was Eleanor Catherine Walsh, Princeton class of 1975, former CEO of Walsh Pharmaceuticals, and the woman whose name was literally engraved on the building we were in. The Eleanor Walsh Memorial Auditorium, named in honor of my late mother, and funded entirely by my personal fortune of $15 million. Let me tell you how I went from being treated like an unwelcome burden at my own grandson's graduation to the person holding the power to cancel the entire ceremony with a single phone call to the dean. The humiliation that would change everything happened on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. Saturday, May 18, 2024, at Princeton University's 277th commencement ceremony. The morning had started with such promise as I prepared for the 3-hour drive from my townhouse in Manhattan's Upper East Side to Princeton, New Jersey, to watch my beloved grandson Michael Walsh Morrison graduate magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering. Michael wasn't just any graduate to me. At 22 years old, he represented everything I had hoped for in the next generation of our family. Brilliant, hardworking, compassionate, and driven by a desire to use his engineering skills to develop medical devices that could help people with disabilities. Throughout his 4 years at Princeton, I had watched him excel academically while working 20 hours a week at the campus library to help cover his living expenses, despite his parents' comfortable income as a corporate lawyer and marketing executive. More than his academic achievements, though, Michael had maintained the kind of close relationship with me that had become increasingly rare in our family. While his parents, my son David and daughter-in-law Rebecca, had become caught up in the social climbing and material pursuits that seemed to define their suburban Connecticut lifestyle, Michael still called me every Sunday evening to tell me about his classes, his research projects, and his dreams of working for a company that developed prosthetic limbs for veterans. "Grandma Ellie," he had said during one of our recent calls, "I can't wait for you to be there when I graduate. You've been such an inspiration to me, especially knowing how you built Walsh Pharmaceuticals from nothing and proved that women could succeed in science and business. I hope someday I can make half the difference in the world that you have." Those words had meant more to me than Michael could have known. At 70, I had spent the past 5 years since my retirement feeling increasingly marginalized by a family that seemed to view me as a relic from another era, rather than someone whose experience and wisdom might still have value. Michael's genuine respect and affection reminded me of why I had worked so hard to build something meaningful, not just for my own success, but to create opportunities and inspiration for the generations that would follow. The irony of what was about to happen at his graduation ceremony was almost breathtaking in its cruel perfection. I had arrived at Princeton University at 8:30 a.m., 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, because I wanted to take photographs of the campus and the Eleanor Walsh Memorial Auditorium in the beautiful spring light. The auditorium, completed in 2019 after 2 years of construction, was a magnificent structure that had required meticulous planning and collaboration with Princeton's architects to ensure it met both the university's aesthetic standards and my specific requirements for honoring my mother's memory. My mother, Catherine Eleanor Walsh, had been Princeton class of 1948, one of only 12 women in her graduating class during an era when female students were barely tolerated at Ivy League institutions. She had gone on to become a pioneering researcher in pharmaceutical chemistry, developing several compounds that formed the foundation for medications still used today to treat autoimmune disorders. When she died in 2017 at the age of 91, I decided that her legacy deserved to be commemorated in a way that would inspire future generations of women in science. The $15 million I donated to build the auditorium wasn't just a financial contribution, it was a carefully structured gift that came with specific provisions designed to ensure that the Walsh family's connection to Princeton would be honored in perpetuity. The donation agreement, negotiated over months with Princeton's development office and board of trustees, included explicit language guaranteeing that members of the Walsh family would have access to reserved seating at any university function, held in the auditorium. The reserved seating wasn't just about comfort or prestige. It was about recognition of the sacrificial generosity that had made the beautiful venue possible. The front 2 rows of the auditorium featured custom brass nameplates reading Walsh Family Reserved Seating, and the donation agreement specified that these seats would be available to Walsh family members in perpetuity for any university, function, ceremony, or event held within the Eleanor Walsh Memorial Auditorium. As I walked through the auditorium that morning, admiring the soaring ceiling with its custom-designed acoustic panels and the Italian marble floors that had required 6 months to source and install, I felt a deep sense of pride and satisfaction. This beautiful space would host graduation ceremonies, concerts, lectures, and special events for decades to come, providing a worthy setting for the important moments in thousands of students' lives. The morning had been perfect until Rebecca Morrison arrived. My daughter-in-law Rebecca had always been a complicated presence in our family dynamics. At 45, she was an intelligent, accomplished woman who worked as a senior marketing executive for a luxury fashion brand. But her relationship with me had been strained since the early days of her marriage to my son David 15 years ago. Rebecca seemed to view me as competition for influence within the family rather than as a resource and support system, and over the years, she had become increasingly skilled at subtle manipulation designed to minimize my role in family decisions and events. Rebecca's approach to managing family relationships was to position herself as the central coordinator and decision-maker, gradually excluding others from planning processes while presenting herself as the person who was taking care of everything so that others didn't need to worry about details. It was a strategy that had allowed her to gain control over holiday celebrations, vacation planning, and major family events while maintaining the appearance of being helpful and organized. When she approached me in the auditorium lobby at 9:15 a.m., Rebecca was dressed in an expensive navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested she was prepared for serious business rather than a casual family celebration. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you're here early," she said, her tone carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "I wanted to talk to you about the seating arrangements before things get too hectic." "Of course," I replied, though I was immediately curious about why seating arrangements would require a private conversation. "I assume we'll be in the reserved section?" Rebecca's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss. We've had some complications with the family seating, and I've had to make some adjustments to accommodate everyone. Who wanted to attend Michael's graduation?" "What kind of complications?" "David's brother Mark decided at the last minute that he wanted to bring his entire family. That's 5 people instead of the 2 we were expecting," Rebecca explained. "And my parents flew in from Arizona as a surprise, so we have 4 additional family members beyond what we originally planned for." I could see where this was heading, but I waited for Rebecca to explain her solution. "So I've rearranged the seating to make sure that the immediate family, David and me, my parents, Mark's family, are in the front section where they'll have the best view of Michael when he receives his diploma," she continued. I've found you a wonderful seat that will still give you a great view of the ceremony. Rebecca, you do realize that the front 2 rows are specifically reserved for Walsh family members? I said, keeping my voice calm despite the growing irritation. I felt it being managed like a problem to be solved. I understand that you have a special connection to the auditorium, Rebecca replied, her tone becoming slightly patronizing. But for Michael's graduation, we need to prioritize the seating for his immediate family members who have been most involved in his college experience. Most involved in his college experience. The phrase was carefully chosen to suggest that I had been a peripheral figure in Michael's life, rather than the grandmother who had attended his high school graduation, helped him with his college application essays, and quietly contributed $50,000 toward his Princeton tuition when Rebecca and David were complaining about the financial burden of Ivy League education. Rebecca, I think there may be some confusion about the seating arrangements, I said. The Walsh family reserved seating is designated specifically for members of our family, and it's not subject to reallocation based on attendance numbers. Rebecca's expression shifted to the look of patient tolerance that I had seen her use when dealing with what she considered unreasonable demands from people who didn't understand the practical constraints she was managing. Eleanor, I appreciate that you want to be close to the action, but we have a large family group to accommodate. And frankly, at your age, I thought you might be more comfortable in a seat that's easier to access and doesn't require squeezing. Past other people if you need to leave during the ceremony. At your age. Rebecca had just suggested that my age made me unsuitable for the reserved seating that was legally and contractually designated for my family, while simultaneously repositioning her desire to exclude me as consideration for my comfort and convenience. Where exactly is this alternative seating? I asked. Rebecca consulted her portfolio and pulled out a seating chart that looked like it had been prepared with the thoroughness of a corporate presentation. I've arranged for you to have a seat near the side aisle where you'll have easy access to restrooms and refreshments, she said, pointing to a location on the chart that was clearly marked as being adjacent to the catering setup area. It's actually a very strategic location because you'll be able to see everything without being crowded by the larger family group. The location she was indicating was at least 30 rows back from the stage, positioned next to the area where the catering staff would be setting up coffee stations and preparing for the post-ceremony reception. It was, quite literally, the kind of seat that would typically be assigned to vendors or service staff, rather than honored family members. Rebecca, that seating assignment is completely unacceptable, I said, my voice remaining calm but carrying a firmness that I hoped would end this ridiculous conversation. I'll be sitting in the Walsh family reserved section, as specified in the donation agreement for this auditorium. Rebecca's mask of diplomatic reasonableness finally slipped, revealing the irritation and entitlement that had been building throughout our conversation. Eleanor, I understand that you're used to being the center of attention, but Michael's graduation is about him and his immediate family, not about accommodating every extended family member who thinks they deserve special treatment, she said, her voice rising slightly despite her obvious effort to maintain control. Every extended family member who thinks they deserve special treatment. Rebecca had just categorized me as an extended family member rather than Michael's grandmother, and the person whose financial generosity had made the very venue of his graduation ceremony possible. But before I could respond to Rebecca's outrageous redefinition of my role in the family, the situation became even more humiliating. A young woman wearing a Princeton University blazer and carrying a clipboard approached us with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested she had been monitoring our conversation and had decided that intervention was necessary. "Excuse me, Mrs. Walsh," she said, addressing me with the polite but distant tone typically used with difficult guests who were disrupting carefully planned logistics. "I'm Jennifer Martinez, the event coordinator for today's ceremony. Mrs. Morrison has informed me that there's been some confusion about your seating assignment." "There's no confusion," I replied. "I'm Eleanor Walsh, and my family has reserved seating in the front section of this auditorium. Jennifer consulted her clipboard with theatrical thoroughness. Mrs. Walsh, I show that Mrs. Morrison submitted the seating arrangements for the Walsh-Morrison family group, and you're assigned to seat G47, which is in our general family seating area. Mrs. Morrison has explained that the front section needs to be reserved for immediate family members only. Mrs. Morrison submitted the seating arrangements for the Walsh-Morrison family group. In a single sentence, Jennifer had revealed that Rebecca had positioned herself as the primary family contact for graduation seating, effectively giving her the authority to override my contractual rights to reserved seating in the auditorium that I had funded. Jennifer, I think you need to check with your supervisor about the Walsh family reserved seating provisions, I said. There may be some institutional memory that hasn't been communicated to the event's planning staff. Jennifer's expression shifted to the kind of patient tolerance typically reserved for elderly people who were confused about policies and procedures that younger, more informed staff members understood perfectly. Mrs. Walsh, I've been coordinating graduation ceremonies for 3 years, and I'm very familiar with all of our seating policies, she said. The front section is reserved for immediate family members of graduating students, and those arrangements are made through the primary family contact. If you have concerns about the seat that Mrs. Morrison has arranged for you, I'd suggest discussing that with her rather than trying to change university policies. Trying to change university policies. Jennifer had just accused me of attempting to manipulate institutional procedures rather than simply claiming the seating rights that were explicitly guaranteed in my donation agreement. At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a seating dispute or Rebecca's control issues. This was about institutional amnesia, family disrespect, and the systematic erasure of my contributions and status by people who either didn't know or didn't care about the sacrifices and generosity that had made their comfortable situations possible. Rebecca stood next to Jennifer with an expression of vindicated satisfaction, clearly pleased that university staff had validated her authority to make seating decisions and had positioned my objections as unreasonable demands from a difficult elderly relative. Eleanor, I hope you can understand that we're just trying to make sure Michael's graduation runs smoothly for everyone, Rebecca said, her tone now carrying the condescending sympathy typically used with people who needed to be managed rather than respected. Your seat in the general family section will give you a lovely view of the ceremony, and you'll be much more comfortable there than you would be squeezed into the front section with all the immediate family members. All the immediate family members. Rebecca had now explicitly excluded me from the category of immediate family, despite the fact that I was Michael's grandmother and had been actively involved in his life since birth. As I stood there in the lobby of the auditorium that I had built, listening to my daughter-in-law and a university staff member explain why I wasn't entitled to the seating that was contractually guaranteed to my family, I felt something shift inside me that was more powerful than anger or hurt. I felt clarity. These people had made assumptions about my powerlessness based on my age, my family position, and their own ignorance about my actual relationship with Princeton University. They were treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected, and they were doing it in the most public and humiliating way possible. But what Rebecca and Jennifer didn't know, as they stood there congratulating themselves on their efficient handling of a difficult elderly relative, was that the woman they were dismissing had more influence over Princeton University than anyone else in that building. They didn't know that I was a member of Princeton's Board of Trustees, a position I had held for 8 years, and which gave me direct access to the university's president and senior administration. They didn't know that I was one of Princeton's largest living donors, with total contributions exceeding $23 million over the past decade for various academic programs, scholarships, and capital improvements. Most importantly, they didn't know that I had developed close personal relationships with Princeton's senior leadership over the course of my 50-year connection to the university, relationships that included not just financial support, but genuine friendship and mutual respect. Dean Patricia Whitmore had been a close friend for over 20 years. We had served together on multiple university committees, had collaborated on developing Princeton's Women in Science initiative, and had shared countless conversations about our experiences as women who had succeeded in male-dominated fields. Patricia had personally thanked me for the auditorium donation and had assured me that the Walsh family would always be honored guests at any Princeton function. More importantly, Patricia had the authority to stop the graduation ceremony entirely if she determined that university protocols weren't being followed properly, or that major donors were being treated in ways that violated institutional commitments. As I looked at Rebecca's smug expression and Jennifer's patronizing smile, I realized that they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between apparent powerlessness and actual influence. But first, I wanted to see exactly how far this disrespect would go, because the more evidence I gathered of how I was being treated, the more satisfying the lesson would be when I finally decided to teach it. "Very well," I said calmly. "I'll take the seat you've assigned me." Rebecca looked surprised by my sudden cooperation, but also relieved that the confrontation was ending without further complications. "Wonderful, Eleanor. I think you'll find that your seat actually has some advantages over the front section," she said, her tone now becoming artificially warm as she sensed victory. "You'll have easy access to refreshments, and you won't be disturbed by all the activity in the immediate family area." Jennifer nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Walsh, I'll have one of our ushers show you to your seat when the auditorium opens for general seating. Thank you for being so understanding about the arrangements." As Rebecca and Jennifer walked away, clearly pleased with their efficient resolution of what they saw as a minor logistical problem, I remained standing in the lobby, processing the full scope of what had just happened. My daughter-in-law had unilaterally decided that I didn't deserve the reserved seating that was contractually guaranteed to my family. A university staff member had dismissed my objections as the unreasonable demands of a confused elderly person. And both of them had done this while standing in the building that existed solely because of my financial generosity. But perhaps most significantly, they had revealed their true opinions about my place in the family and my value as a person. To Rebecca, I was an extended family member whose presence was tolerated, but whose comfort and dignity were expendable when they conflicted with her preferences. To Jennifer, I was just another elderly relative who needed to be managed and placated rather than respected and accommodated. As the auditorium began filling with families arriving for the graduation ceremony, I watched Rebecca greet the various family members she had prioritized over me. David's brother Mark and his wife and 3 children were shown to prime seats in the front row, despite the fact that Mark had barely spoken to Michael in the past 2 years and had missed most of his important milestones. Rebecca's parents, who had met Michael exactly 3 times in his life, were seated in the second row with perfect views of the stage. Meanwhile, I was directed to seat G47, a folding chair positioned next to the catering station where staff members were setting up coffee urns and arranging pastries for the post-ceremony reception. The location was not just physically uncomfortable, it was symbolically devastating, positioning me alongside the service staff rather than with the honored family members. As I sat in my assigned seat, watching my own family enjoy the premium seating in the auditorium I had built, while university staff treated me like a problem that had been solved, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact that I hadn't used in several months, but that would change everything about this graduation ceremony. The contact was simply labeled Patricia Dean, but it represented one of the most powerful relationships in my life, and certainly the most relevant to my current situation. "Dean Patricia." Whitmore answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, what a wonderful surprise," Patricia said, her voice carrying genuine warmth and pleasure. "Please tell me you're calling from Princeton. I heard through the grapevine that your grandson is graduating today." "I am calling from Princeton, Patricia, and I'm sitting in the Eleanor Walsh Memorial Auditorium," I said. "But I'm afraid I'm calling about a rather serious problem with how the university is handling donor relations and contractual commitments." The tone of Patricia's voice shifted immediately from social warmth to professional concern. Eleanor, what's happened? Is there a problem with the auditorium or the ceremony logistics? Patricia, I'm currently seated in folding chair G47, next to the catering station, because your event staff has decided that the Walsh family reserved seating can be overridden by family members who want to make alternative arrangements, I explained. Despite the explicit provisions in our donation agreement guaranteeing reserved seating for Walsh family members, I've been told that those commitments are subject to reallocation based on attendance numbers and family preferences. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor, that's absolutely unacceptable. The reserved seating provisions in your donation agreement are legally binding commitments that cannot be overridden by event coordinators or family members. Who authorized this seating change? According to your event coordinator, my daughter-in-law submitted alternative seating arrangements that exclude me from the reserved section, I said. When I objected, I was told that university policy prioritizes immediate family members over extended family members and that my contractual seating rights could be disregarded. Another pause. Longer this time. Eleanor, I need you to know that whoever told you that was completely wrong about university policy and completely ignorant of your donation agreement. The reserved seating in the Walsh Auditorium is your seating. Period. No family member and no event staff have the authority to override those provisions. Patricia, I appreciate your concern, but the damage has already been done, I said. I'm sitting next to the coffee station while people who contributed nothing to this university occupy the seats that were reserved for my family. More importantly, your staff treated me like a difficult elderly person who was making unreasonable demands rather than like a major donor whose contractual rights were being violated. Eleanor, I am absolutely appalled by what you're describing, Patricia said, her voice now carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested serious consequences were coming for someone. This is not just a violation of your donation agreement. It's a complete failure of institutional respect and donor relations. I'm going to fix this immediately. How do you propose to do that, Patricia? The ceremony begins in 30 minutes, and the entire family is already seated according to my daughter-in-law's preferences. Eleanor, I'm the Dean of Students, and I have the authority to halt any university ceremony if I determine that institutional protocols are being violated or that the university is failing to meet its commitments to major donors, Patricia said. I can stop this graduation ceremony right now and reorganize the seating to comply with your donation agreement. Stop the graduation ceremony. Patricia was offering to cancel Michael's graduation and the graduation of 200 other students unless the university honored its commitments to me. The offer was both satisfying and terrifying. On one hand, it would certainly teach Rebecca and Jennifer a lesson about the consequences of disrespecting major donors and violating contractual commitments. On the other hand, it would turn Michael's graduation into a public spectacle and potentially damage his memories of what should be one of the most important days of his life. Patricia, I don't want to ruin Michael's graduation, I said. But I also can't let this kind of treatment stand without consequences. Eleanor, you're not the one who would be ruining anything, Patricia replied firmly. The people who violated your donation agreement and treated you disrespectfully are the ones who created this situation. I'm simply offering to enforce the contractual commitments that the university made to you. As I sat there in my folding chair next to the coffee station, watching my family enjoy the seats that should have been mine while 2,400 people filled the auditorium I had built, I realized that this moment was about much more than seating arrangements or family dynamics. This was about respect, recognition, and the fundamental question of whether people who had sacrificed and contributed to make beautiful things possible would be honored for their generosity or dismissed as inconvenient when their presence conflicted with other people's preferences. The relic they thought they could shuffle off to sit with the catering staff was about to remind everyone exactly what happened when you mistake generosity for weakness and confuse age with powerlessness. The graduation ceremony was about to become a very different kind of educational experience than anyone had planned. To understand how I ended up being treated like a discarded elderly relative by my own family while sitting in an auditorium that I had personally built, you need to know who Eleanor Catherine Walsh was before she became the target of her daughter-in-law's calculated dismissal and Princeton University's institutional amnesia. Because the woman they thought they could shuffle off to sit next to the coffee station wasn't just some forgotten grandmother clinging to past relevance. I was someone who had built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing, revolutionized women's opportunities in science, and accumulated the kind of strategic influence that could reshape entire institutions with a single conversation. My story begins in 1954, when I was born Eleanor Catherine Murphy in a modest two-bedroom apartment above Murphy's Corner Pharmacy in Camden, New Jersey. My father, Thomas Murphy, was a third-generation Irish immigrant who had inherited the small neighborhood pharmacy from his father and ran it with the kind of meticulous attention to detail and genuine care for customers that made him a trusted fixture in a working-class community where people often had to choose between buying groceries and filling prescriptions. My mother, Catherine Rose Murphy, was a registered nurse who had graduated from the top of her class at Camden General Hospital's nursing program in 1952, but who had been forced to quit her hospital position when she became pregnant with me because, married, women with children had no business taking jobs away from men who needed to support families. Instead, she used her medical knowledge to help my father transform our small pharmacy into something approaching a community health clinic, providing basic medical advice, monitoring blood pressure, and helping elderly customers manage complex medication regimens. The Murphy family wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we were rich in values that would shape every decision I would make for the next 70 years. Hard work wasn't just expected. It was a form of worship, a way of honoring the opportunities that previous generations had sacrificed to provide. Education wasn't a luxury or a social expectation. It was the foundation of freedom, the only thing that could lift a person above the circumstances of their birth and create possibilities that didn't exist for their parents. Integrity wasn't something you practiced when it was convenient. It was the core of your character, especially when maintaining it cost you something valuable. But perhaps most importantly, my parents taught me that true success wasn't measured by what you accumulated for yourself, but by what you made possible for others. Eleanor Catherine, my mother would say as we worked together in the pharmacy after school, counting pills and organizing inventory. Intelligence and opportunity are gifts that come with responsibilities. If you're blessed with advantages that other people don't have, you use those advantages to create opportunities for people who are still fighting for the chances you've been given. Growing up in Camden during the 1960s meant understanding that opportunities were limited, especially for women who had ambitions beyond marriage and motherhood. The town had exactly one female doctor, one female lawyer, and a handful of businesswomen who had inherited family enterprises rather than building their own. Most girls my age assumed they would marry local boys, raise children, and spend their lives within a 20-mile radius of where they were born. But my mother had different plans for me. Catherine Murphy had graduated from Princeton University in 1948 with a degree in chemistry, an almost unheard-of achievement for a woman from her background, and she was determined that her daughter would have educational opportunities that extended far beyond the limitations of small-town expectations. Eleanor, your father and I are saving every penny we can to make sure you can go to college wherever you want to go, she would tell me as we sat at our kitchen table each evening, working through homework assignments that she had supplemented, with additional reading and laboratory experiments that we conducted using equipment borrowed from my father's pharmacy. But education is just the foundation. What you build on that foundation will determine whether you spend your life asking for opportunities or creating them for yourself and others. My mother's words proved prophetic in ways that neither of us could have anticipated when I was a gangly 14-year-old struggling with organic chemistry and dreaming of a world larger than Camden, New Jersey. I was an exceptional student, but more than that, I was a strategic thinker who understood that academic achievement was my pathway to a larger world where intelligence and determination could overcome the limitations of gender and economic background. By high school, I was class valedictorian, editor of the school newspaper, president of the science club, and the first student in Camden High School history to be accepted to Princeton University with a full academic scholarship. The day I received my acceptance letter in the spring of 1972, my father closed the pharmacy early and my mother cried tears of joy and pride that I can still remember 52 years later. We celebrated at Rosario's Italian restaurant, the fanciest establishment in Camden, and I felt like I was embarking on a journey that would transform not just my life, but the possibilities for future generations of Murphy women. Princeton, in the early 1970s, was a revelation and a challenge in equal measure. I had never been surrounded by so many brilliant, ambitious people who assumed that intelligence should be developed and used to make meaningful contributions to society. For the first time in my life, being smart wasn't something that made me different or threatening. It was simply the baseline expectation for participation in academic and social life. But Princeton was also an institution where women were still viewed as experimental additions to a fundamentally male environment. The university had only begun admitting women as undergraduates in 1969, and by the time I arrived in 1972, the female student body numbered fewer than 200 in a total enrollment of over 4,000. We were pioneers in an environment that was simultaneously supportive of our intellectual ambitions and skeptical of our long-term commitment to careers that would compete with traditional family responsibilities. Majored in chemistry with a concentration in biochemistry, planning to attend medical school and eventually work in pharmaceutical research, developing medications for diseases that disproportionately affected women, conditions that had been historically understudied because medical research focused primarily on male subjects. The field of pharmaceutical chemistry was just beginning to recognize that drug development needed to account for biological differences between men and women, and I wanted to be part of the generation that would create more effective and safer medications for conditions like osteoporosis, autoimmune disorders, and hormonal imbalances. It was during my junior year at Princeton that I first encountered the research that would define my career and ultimately make my fortune. Professor Margaret Chen, one of only 3 female faculty members in Princeton's chemistry department, was conducting groundbreaking research on hormone replacement therapy, work that would eventually lead to safer and more effective treatments for menopausal symptoms and age-related hormonal deficiencies. Eleanor, you have the kind of analytical mind that could revolutionize pharmaceutical development, Professor Chen told me after I had spent a summer working in her laboratory, developing more precise methods for measuring hormone levels in blood samples. The pharmaceutical industry is on the verge of major breakthroughs in personalized medicine, but they need researchers who understand both the scientific principles and the business applications of new discoveries. Professor Chen's mentorship opened my eyes to the possibility of combining scientific research with entrepreneurial thinking, using laboratory discoveries as the foundation for building companies that could bring innovative treatments to market, while generating the resources needed to fund additional research and development. After graduating from Princeton in 1975 as the top student in the chemistry department, I faced a choice that would determine the trajectory of my entire career. I had been accepted to medical school at Johns Hopkins, which would have led to a traditional career as a physician researcher. But I had also been offered a position as a junior researcher at Merck & Co., where I could work on pharmaceutical development while learning about the business side of drug discovery and commercialization. I chose Merck, despite the concerns of advisors who worried that I was abandoning the more prestigious path of academic medicine for the uncertain world of corporate research. But I had already begun to understand that the fastest way to create meaningful change in healthcare was to develop products that could be manufactured and distributed at scale, reaching millions of patients rather than the hundreds I might treat as an individual physician. The next 8 years at Merck were simultaneously the most challenging and most educational period of my life. I worked on research teams developing new treatments for autoimmune disorders, collaborated with FDA regulators on clinical trial design, and learned how pharmaceutical companies made decisions about which research projects received funding and which potential treatments made it to market. But more importantly, I began to understand the business principles that determined success or failure in pharmaceutical development. Scientific brilliance wasn't enough. You needed to understand market dynamics, regulatory requirements, manufacturing constraints, and the complex financial calculations that determined whether a new drug would be profitable enough to justify the enormous costs of development and clinical testing. By 1983, I had been promoted to Senior Research Director at Merck, leading a team of 12 researchers working on hormone replacement therapies. But I had also begun to identify significant gaps in the market, medical conditions that affected millions of women, but that major pharmaceutical companies considered too risky or insufficiently profitable to pursue. The entrepreneurial opportunity that would change my life came when I discovered that my research team at Merck had developed a compound that showed remarkable promise for treating severe autoimmune conditions, but that Merck's executive team had decided not to pursue because the target patient population was considered too small to justify the development costs. Eleanor, you've done excellent work on this compound, but we've decided to focus our autoimmune research on conditions with larger patient populations, my supervisor explained during a meeting that would ultimately cost Merck hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue. Rheumatoid arthritis and lupus affect too few patients to make this compound commercially viable for a company of our size. Rheumatoid arthritis and lupus affected too few patients, only about 3.2 million Americans, most of them women who had limited treatment options and who suffered from progressive joint damage and organ complications that could be life-threatening. Merck was walking away from a potential treatment for millions of people because the profit margins weren't large enough to meet their corporate financial targets. That night, I went home to my small apartment in Princeton and made the decision. That would define the rest of my career. I was going to leave Merck, license the rights to the compound they were abandoning, and start my own pharmaceutical company focused on developing treatments for conditions that major corporations considered insufficiently profitable. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating decision I had ever made. I was 29 years old, had $47,000 in savings, and was planning to compete against pharmaceutical giants with research budgets that exceeded the GDP of small countries. I had no business experience beyond what I had observed at Merck, no investors, and no guarantee that I could successfully navigate the regulatory approval process that could take years and cost millions of dollars. But I also had something that most pharmaceutical entrepreneurs lacked: deep scientific expertise in the specific compounds I was planning to develop, established relationships with FDA regulators from my work at Merck, and a clear understanding of an underserved patient population that desperately needed better treatment options. Walsh Pharmaceuticals was founded in January 1984 in a 1,200-square-foot laboratory space in Trenton, New Jersey, with startup capital of $75,000, my savings plus a small business loan that required my parents to use their house as collateral. For the first 2 years, I was the company's only full-time employee, conducting research during the day, writing FDA applications in the evenings, and spending weekends visiting rheumatologists and autoimmune specialists to understand exactly what kinds of treatments their patients needed most. The early years of Walsh Pharmaceuticals were a constant struggle against overwhelming odds. Pharmaceutical development requires enormous capital investments with no guarantee of success. Clinical trials can cost millions of dollars and take years to complete, and the vast majority of promising compounds ultimately fail to receive FDA approval. I was competing against companies with research budgets that were hundreds of times larger than my entire company's annual revenue, but I had advantages that I didn't fully appreciate until years later. As a woman-owned company developing treatments for conditions that primarily affected women, Walsh Pharmaceuticals attracted attention from investors who were looking for opportunities to support female entrepreneurs and address medical needs that had been historically neglected by male-dominated pharmaceutical companies. More importantly, my scientific background allowed me to make research and development decisions with a level of precision and efficiency that many larger companies couldn't match. While pharmaceutical giants often pursued multiple research tracks simultaneously, spreading their expertise across dozens of potential products, I could focus my company's entire scientific capacity on perfecting a single compound that I understood better than anyone else in the industry. The breakthrough that established Walsh Pharmaceuticals as a major player in the pharmaceutical industry came in 1989, when our first drug, WP1, a revolutionary treatment for rheumatoid arthritis, received FDA approval after 5 years of clinical trials that demonstrated remarkable effectiveness with minimal side effects. Unlike existing treatments that simply managed symptoms, WP1 actually slowed the progression of joint damage and allowed patients to maintain mobility and independence for years longer than had been possible with previous medications. The commercial success of WP1 exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Within 2 years of FDA approval, Walsh Pharmaceuticals was generating over $200 million in annual revenue, and WP1 had become the gold standard treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. But more importantly, we were receiving letters from patients whose lives had been transformed by access to a medication that allowed them to continue working, caring for their families, and pursuing activities that had become impossible due to the progression of their autoimmune condition. The success of WP1 provided Walsh Pharmaceuticals with the financial foundation needed to expand our research and development programs into other underserved medical conditions. Over the next 15 years, we developed and brought to market 6 additional medications for autoimmune disorders, hormonal imbalances, and age-related conditions that primarily affected women. By 2004, Walsh Pharmaceuticals had grown into a company with over 300 employees, annual revenues exceeding $800 million, and a research pipeline that included potential treatments for multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, and several rare genetic disorders. We had established ourselves as the leading pharmaceutical company focused on women's health issues, and our medications were being used by over 2 million patients worldwide. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't financial. It was the Walsh Women in Science Foundation, which I established in 1995 to provide scholarships and research grants for female students pursuing careers in chemistry, biochemistry, and pharmaceutical research. The foundation had awarded over $50 million in educational support, helping hundreds of young women obtain the advanced degrees and research experience needed to succeed in fields where they remained significantly underrepresented. The decision to sell Walsh Pharmaceuticals came in 2019, when I was 65 years old and beginning to think about retirement and legacy planning. Several major pharmaceutical companies had been pursuing acquisition discussions for years, but I had always been reluctant to sell the company I had built from nothing into one of the most successful woman-owned businesses in American history. The offer that finally convinced me came from Biopharma International, a company that demonstrated genuine commitment to continuing Walsh Pharmaceuticals' focus on women's health research and maintaining our corporate culture of scientific excellence and social responsibility. The acquisition price of $2.8 billion reflected not just the commercial value of our existing products and research pipeline, but the strategic value of our specialized expertise and established relationships with patients, physicians, and regulatory agencies. More importantly, the acquisition agreement included provisions that would ensure the Walsh Women in Science Foundation would continue operating in perpetuity, with Biopharma International committing to contribute an additional $100 million to the foundation's endowment. The women's health research programs that had been the foundation of Walsh Pharmaceuticals would be expanded rather than discontinued, and the company's commitment to developing treatments for underserved patient populations would become part of Biopharma International's corporate mission. The $2.8 billion sale of Walsh Pharmaceuticals represented the culmination of 35 years of work that had begun with a $75,000 investment and a single experimental compound that Merck had considered commercially unviable. But more than financial success, the sale validated my belief that it was possible to build a profitable business while making meaningful contributions to solving problems that affected millions of people who had been overlooked by larger, more established companies. After the sale, I retained approximately $2.1 billion after taxes and transaction costs, wealth that provided not just financial security, but the resources needed to support causes and institutions that had been important to my success and that could create opportunities for future generations of women in science and business. My relationship with Princeton University had begun as an undergraduate in the 1970s, but it had evolved over the decades into something approaching a partnership in advancing women's opportunities in science and technology. Between 1995 and 2019, I had contributed over $23 million to Princeton for scholarships, research programs, facility improvements, and endowed professorships focused on chemistry, biochemistry, and women's studies. The most significant of these contributions was the $15 million donation in 2019 to build the Eleanor Walsh Memorial Auditorium, named in honor of my mother and designed to serve as a venue for graduation ceremonies, academic, conferences, and cultural events that would inspire future generations of Princeton students. But the auditorium wasn't just a memorial. It was a statement about the importance of recognizing and honoring the contributions of women who had blazed trails in fields where female participation had been limited or discouraged. My service on Princeton's Board of Trustees, which began in 2016, reflected my commitment to ensuring that the university would continue expanding opportunities for women and students from non-traditional backgrounds. As one of only 4 female trustees, and the only trustee who had built and sold a major company, I brought perspectives and experiences that were often missing from discussions about university priorities and strategic planning. But perhaps most importantly, my relationship with Princeton represented my understanding that individual success created obligations to support institutions and programs that could provide opportunities for people who were still fighting for the chances that I had been fortunate enough to receive. Education had been the foundation of my ability to build Walsh Pharmaceuticals and accumulate the resources needed to support causes I cared about. Ensuring that future generations had access to excellent educational opportunities was both a practical investment in society's future and a moral obligation to honor the sacrifices that had made my success possible. The woman who was sitting in folding chair G47 next to the coffee station at her grandson's graduation ceremony wasn't just someone who had been successful in business. I was someone who had spent 50 years building relationships, accumulating influence, and developing the kind of strategic thinking that comes with decades of competing against larger, more established competitors and winning. My daughter-in-law Rebecca and Princeton's event coordinator Jennifer had made assumptions about my powerlessness based on my age and my apparent willingness to accept their seating decisions without confrontation. They saw an elderly woman who could be managed and dismissed rather than a former CEO who had built a pharmaceutical empire by identifying opportunities that others had overlooked and developing strategies that could outmaneuver much larger competitors. But what they were about to discover was that underestimating someone based on superficial characteristics, age, gender, apparent social position, was exactly the kind of strategic error that had allowed me to build Walsh Pharmaceuticals into a $2.8 billion company, while competitors who appeared more formidable failed to recognize emerging market opportunities. The phone call I was about to make to Dean Patricia Whitmore would demonstrate that the woman they thought they could shuffle off to sit with the catering staff had spent decades developing relationships and accumulating influence that could reshape entire institutions with a single conversation. Rebecca. Morrison was about to learn that dismissing someone without understanding their actual capabilities and connections was the most expensive mistake she could possibly make. And Princeton University was about to be reminded that institutional amnesia about major donors and their contractual rights could have consequences that extended far beyond uncomfortable conversations about seating arrangements. The relic they thought they could ignore was about to provide a very public education about respect, recognition, and the difference between apparent powerlessness and actual influence. To understand how I ended up trusting my family enough to allow them to coordinate my grandson's graduation arrangements, ultimately enabling the humiliation I experienced that May morning, you need to know how my relationship with my son David and his wife Rebecca had evolved over the 15 years since their marriage, and how the profound grief and isolation following my husband's death had created vulnerabilities that I didn't recognize until it was too late, because the woman who had spent 35 years outmaneuvering pharmaceutical giants had somehow allowed herself to become susceptible to manipulation by people who were supposed to love and protect her. My son David Christopher Walsh had been the center of my world from the moment he was born on September 15, 1982. After 8 years of fertility struggles that had tested every aspect of my marriage to my beloved husband, Dr. James Morrison Walsh. James, a distinguished cardiologist whom I had met during my early years at Merck, had been my partner, not just, in marriage, but in building the vision and values that would guide Walsh Pharmaceuticals through its most challenging and successful years. The fertility journey that preceded David's birth had been devastating in ways that people who haven't experienced it can't fully understand. Month after month of hope, followed by disappointment. Medical procedures that were both expensive and emotionally exhausting, and the constant question of whether we would ever have the family that we had always assumed would be a natural part of our lives together. When David finally arrived, healthy, perfect, and absolutely worth every moment of the struggle it had taken to bring him into the world, James and I approached parenthood with a level of gratitude and intentionality that shaped every decision we made about his upbringing. We weren't just raising a child, we were stewarding a gift that we had never taken for granted. Eleanor, James would say as we watched 3-year-old David conducting elaborate experiments with his building blocks, this little boy is going to change the world someday. Our job is to give him the foundation he needs to do whatever good he's meant to accomplish. David grew up surrounded by conversations about science, business ethics, social responsibility, and the importance of using whatever privileges and opportunities you were given to make life better for people who had fewer advantages. James and I were building Walsh Pharmaceuticals during David's childhood, and our dinner table conversations often revolved around the challenges and rewards of developing medications that could help people while building a sustainable business that could continue funding research and development. But more than professional success, James and I prioritized raising David with a sense of empathy, humility, and service that would guide his decisions throughout his life. We wanted him to understand that financial success was meaningful only if it was used to create opportunities for others, and that true happiness came from contributing to something larger than your own comfort and advancement. David absorbed these lessons naturally, growing into a thoughtful, compassionate young man who excelled academically and socially while maintaining the kind of genuine concern for others that made him genuinely liked by his peers and respected by his teachers. He was student body president in high school, captain of the debate team, and valedictorian of his graduating class. But he was also the kind of young man who spent his summers volunteering at homeless shelters and tutoring younger students who were struggling academically. When David was accepted to Harvard Law School after graduating summa cum laude from Princeton in 2004, James and I felt the same pride that my parents had experienced when I was accepted to Princeton 30 years earlier. We were watching our son prepare to build on the foundation we had provided while developing his own vision for how to use his talents and opportunities to make meaningful contributions to society. David's law school years were marked by the same combination of academic excellence and social commitment that had characterized his undergraduate education. He served as editor of the Harvard Law Review, graduated in the top 5% of his class, and was recruited by several prestigious corporate law firms that offered starting salaries exceeding $300,000 per year. But David surprised everyone, including James and me, when he turned down the lucrative corporate positions to accept a job with the Environmental Defense Fund, where he could use his legal training to work on environmental protection cases that would affect public health and safety for generations to come. Mom, Dad, I know you've invested a lot in my education, and I know I could make more money at a corporate firm, David explained during a family dinner in the spring of 2007. But I've watched you build Walsh Pharmaceuticals by focusing on treatments that other companies ignored because they weren't profitable enough. I want to use my legal training to protect environmental resources that might not be economically valuable, but that are essential for public health. James and I couldn't have been prouder. David had absorbed the values we had tried to instill and was applying them to his own career choices, even when those choices involved financial sacrifice and professional uncertainty. It was during his second year at the Environmental Defense Fund that David met Rebecca Martinez, a 29-year-old marketing executive at a boutique consulting firm that specialized in sustainability campaigns for Fortune 500 companies. Rebecca was intelligent, accomplished, and apparently shared David's commitment to environmental protection and social responsibility. When David brought Rebecca home to meet us during Thanksgiving 2008, James and I were immediately impressed by her professionalism, her knowledge of environmental issues, and her apparent genuine affection for our son. Rebecca asked thoughtful questions about Walsh Pharmaceuticals, expressed interest in the challenges of bringing new medications to market, and seemed to understand and appreciate the values that were important to our family. Dr. and Mrs. Walsh, she said as I served coffee after Thanksgiving dinner, David has told me so much about how you've built your company by focusing on treatments for conditions that other pharmaceutical companies overlooked. That's such an inspiring example of how business success and social responsibility can work together. She seemed to understand that financial success was meaningful only when it was used to create opportunities for others, and she appeared to support David's decision to pursue public interest law rather than maximizing his income potential. Throughout the weekend, I watched Rebecca encourage David to talk about his environmental law cases, offer thoughtful feedback on his legal strategies, and express enthusiasm for his plans to specialize in cases involving pharmaceutical companies and environmental health. James and I were genuinely pleased by Rebecca's intelligence and apparent compatibility with David's values and ambitions. More importantly, David was clearly happier and more confident when Rebecca was around, speaking more enthusiastically about his work and his plans for the future. When David called 6 months later to tell us that he and Rebecca were engaged, James and I were delighted for them. They seemed like a couple who shared fundamental values about using their professional skills to make positive contributions to society, who supported each other's career ambitions, and who were building a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The wedding, held in Princeton in June 2009, was a beautiful celebration that brought together David's law school friends, Rebecca's marketing colleagues, and our extended network of scientific and business associates. Rebecca looked radiant in her wedding dress. David was clearly ecstatic, and the ceremony reflected their shared commitment to building a life together based on love, integrity, and service to causes larger than themselves. James and I contributed $100,000 toward the wedding expenses, and we also established a $250,000 trust fund as a wedding gift to help David and Rebecca build financial security while pursuing careers in public interest law and environmental consulting, fields that were personally fulfilling but not necessarily financially lucrative. The first few years of David and Rebecca's marriage seemed to fulfill all of our hopes for their happiness and success. David was promoted to senior attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund and was leading high-profile cases involving pharmaceutical pollution and chemical contamination that affected public health. Rebecca's consulting firm was growing rapidly, and she was developing sustainability strategies for major corporations that wanted to improve their environmental performance. They purchased a beautiful colonial house in Westfield, New Jersey, close enough to David's office in Manhattan that he could commute by train while living in a community that offered the kind of suburban lifestyle that they both wanted. The house needed some renovation work, which David approached as an opportunity to implement sustainable design principles while creating a home that reflected their personal style and environmental values. James and I visited regularly during those early years, helping with renovation projects, hosting holiday celebrations, and watching David and Rebecca build the kind of life that we had always hoped our son would create. Rebecca seemed to be thriving in her role as wife and homemaker, developing friendships with other young professionals in their neighborhood while maintaining her successful consulting career. When Michael was born in August 2011, completing their family with a healthy, beautiful baby who inherited David's thoughtful expression and Rebecca's determined chin, James and I felt like we were watching our deepest dreams come to fruition. David was succeeding professionally while maintaining his commitment to meaningful work. Rebecca was balancing motherhood with her own career ambitions, and Michael was growing up in an environment of love, financial stability, and intellectual stimulation. But looking back now, I realize that the early signs of Rebecca's true character were present even during those seemingly happy years, though they were subtle enough that James and I attributed them to the normal stresses of new parenthood and career building rather than to fundamental character flaws that would eventually create serious problems for our family. Rebecca had always been somewhat materialistic and status-conscious, but during the early years of their marriage, her focus on designer clothes, expensive home furnishings, and luxury experiences seemed like harmless preferences rather than compulsive needs that would eventually create financial and emotional pressures on their relationship. She had a way of making comments about friends who had moved to larger houses in more prestigious neighborhoods, about private schools that successful families chose for their children, and about vacation destinations and cultural activities that were standard among their social circle. The language was always careful and reasonable, framed in terms of providing opportunities for Michael rather than satisfying Rebecca's personal ambitions. James, Eleanor. I remember her saying during one of our visits when Michael was about 2 years old, "We've been thinking about Michael's educational future, and we want to make sure he has access to the best possible opportunities. The public schools in Westfield are good, but we're researching private schools that might provide more individualized attention and stronger preparation for college. Private schools that cost $35,000 per year, in addition to the mortgage, property, taxes, and living expenses that were already stretching David's public interest salary." But Rebecca framed the discussion in terms of Michael's opportunities rather than social status, making it difficult to object without appearing to oppose what was best for our grandson. Similarly, Rebecca began making comments about their house, how the neighborhood was perfectly fine for a young family just starting out, but how they would eventually want to move somewhere that offered better long-term investment potential and stronger community resources for raising children. Better long-term investment potential meant houses that cost $800,000 or more in communities where the average family income was well above what David could earn as an environmental attorney. But again, Rebecca's language was careful to frame these desires in terms of practical considerations and Michael's welfare rather than her own social ambitions. The financial pressures that Rebecca's expectations created became more apparent as Michael grew older, and her vision for their family's lifestyle became more expensive and elaborate. David's salary at the Environmental Defense Fund, while respectable for public interest work, couldn't support the kind of life that Rebecca seemed to expect: private school tuition, luxury vacations, expensive cars, and a house in one of New Jersey's most prestigious communities. I began to notice that David seemed increasingly stressed and tired during our visits, often working late evenings and weekends on cases that demanded enormous amounts of research and preparation. When I asked him about his workload, He explained that he was taking on additional consulting projects to supplement his Environmental Defense Fund salary. Mom, Rebecca, and I want to make sure Michael has every possible advantage, and that requires some financial sacrifices on my part, he said during one of our conversations. I'm doing some consulting work for corporate law firms on environmental compliance issues. It pays well, and it allows me to maintain my public interest work while also building the financial security that our family needs. Consulting work for corporate law firms. Exactly the kind of work that David had rejected when he graduated from law school because it conflicted with his environmental advocacy. But Rebecca's expectations had created financial pressures that made it difficult for David to maintain his idealistic career choices without supplemental income from the corporate sector he had originally avoided. The transformation in David's career trajectory was gradual but unmistakable. By 2015, he was spending more time on corporate consulting than on Environmental Defense Fund cases, and his enthusiasm for environmental law seemed to be diminishing as financial pressures consumed more of his time and energy. When David finally left the Environmental Defense Fund in 2016 to join Harrison, Caldwell and Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious corporate law firms, I felt a profound sadness that went beyond disappointment about his career choices. I was watching my son abandon the values and commitments that had defined his identity for almost 30 years, apparently because his wife's lifestyle expectations couldn't be satisfied on a public interest salary. David, are you sure this is what you want? I asked during a family dinner where he announced his career change. You've spent 8 years building expertise in environmental law and making real contributions to protecting public health. Mom, I'm not abandoning environmental work, David replied, though his explanation seemed more defensive than confident. Harrison Caldwell has a strong environmental compliance practice, and I'll be helping corporations develop more sustainable business practices. It's just a different approach to the same goals. Different approach to the same goals, except that instead of holding corporations accountable for environmental violations, David would now be helping them avoid accountability while maintaining the appearance of environmental responsibility. The transformation was both professionally and morally devastating to watch. But perhaps more concerning than David's career changes was the gradual shift in how Rebecca treated James and me. During the early years of their marriage, Rebecca had been warm, respectful, and apparently grateful for our support and involvement in their lives. But as David's income increased and their lifestyle became more elaborate, Rebecca seemed to view us more as intrusive presences who complicated her efforts to establish herself as the central authority in their family's decisions. The changes were subtle at first: phone calls that became less frequent and more superficial, invitations to family events that came with more conditions and restrictions, conversations that felt more formal and transactional rather than warm and familial. Most troubling of all, I began to feel like Rebecca was actively working to limit our time with Michael, using scheduling conflicts and parenting decisions to reduce our involvement in his daily life, while positioning herself as the primary influence on his development and education. Eleanor James, I hope you understand that Michael's schedule is getting more demanding as he gets older, Rebecca explained when we asked about visiting for his birthday celebration. Between school, tutoring, music lessons, and sports activities, we have to be very strategic about family time and social commitments. Strategic about family time, as if spending time with his grandparents was a social commitment that needed to be managed rather than a family relationship that should be nurtured and prioritized. But James and I attributed these changes to the normal evolution of family dynamics as young parents became more confident and established in their own decision-making. We assumed that Rebecca's increasing distance was a temporary adjustment, rather than a deliberate strategy to marginalize our influence and involvement in Michael's life. The event that would fundamentally alter our family dynamics and create the vulnerability that would eventually be exploited happened on November 12, 2021, when James suffered a massive heart attack while attending a medical conference in Chicago. Despite being one of the most respected cardiologists in the country, and receiving immediate treatment from colleagues who understood exactly what was happening. James died 3 hours later at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Losing James after 39 years of marriage was devastating in ways that I couldn't have anticipated, even though I had watched friends and colleagues experience similar losses. James hadn't just been my husband, he had been my closest advisor, my emotional anchor, and the person who had helped me navigate every major decision in my personal and professional life for nearly 4 decades. More than the personal grief, James's death left me feeling profoundly isolated and uncertain about my place in a world that we had built together, but that now felt foreign and overwhelming without his presence and perspective. The immediate aftermath of James's death was a blur of funeral arrangements, legal procedures, and the overwhelming logistics of managing a shared life that had suddenly become a solitary existence. David and Rebecca were supportive during those first few weeks, helping with funeral planning, coordinating with family and friends, and ensuring that I wasn't alone during the most difficult period of my life. But within a few months of James's funeral, I began to notice changes in how David and Rebecca interacted with me that seemed to reflect a fundamental shift in how they viewed my role in their lives and Michael's upbringing. The warm, supportive interactions during James's illness and funeral were gradually replaced by interactions that felt more distant, more managed, and more conditional. Phone calls became less frequent and more superficial. Invitations to family gatherings became less common and often came with scheduling restrictions that made it difficult for me to participate fully. Most concerning of all, I began to feel like Rebecca was systematically working to reduce my involvement in Michael's life, using my grief and adjustment difficulties as justification for limiting contact between us. Eleanor, I know this is a difficult time for you, and we want to make sure that Michael's routine isn't disrupted while you're processing your loss, Rebecca explained when I asked about maintaining our regular Sunday dinners together. Maybe we could try to get together once a month instead of weekly, just until you're feeling more like yourself again. Processing your loss, as if my grief over losing the love of my life was a temporary inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than a fundamental change that required ongoing support and accommodation from family members. But I was too overwhelmed by my own emotional and practical challenges to recognize that Rebecca was exploiting my vulnerability to achieve something she had probably wanted for years: reduced involvement from James and me in their family's decisions and Michael's upbringing. What I didn't understand was that James's death had fundamentally altered the power dynamics in our family, removing the person who had always served as a buffer between Rebecca's more manipulative tendencies and my increasingly vulnerable position as an elderly widow. The woman who had spent 35 years building and running a pharmaceutical empire, who had outmaneuvered competitors with resources that were orders of magnitude larger than mine, who had successfully navigated regulatory challenges and market pressures that destroyed other companies, had somehow become susceptible to manipulation by a daughter-in-law who understood exactly how to exploit grief and isolation for her own benefit. James had always been better at recognizing and managing Rebecca's more problematic behaviors. He had a way of deflecting her subtle criticisms and manipulative comments, redirecting conversations before they became confrontational, and maintaining family harmony without enabling harmful dynamics. Eleanor, he had said during one of our private conversations about Rebecca's increasing control over family decisions, some people show love by trying to control everything around them. Rebecca shows love by managing situations and people to create the outcomes she thinks are best. We just have to be patient and consistent while making sure she doesn't cross lines that damage our relationship with David and Michael. But without James's diplomatic skills and emotional intelligence, I found myself increasingly isolated and uncertain about how to maintain meaningful relationships with David and Michael while navigating Rebecca's subtle but persistent efforts to marginalize my influence and involvement. The grief and loneliness that followed James's death had created exactly the kind of vulnerability that Rebecca needed to begin implementing changes that would have been impossible while James was alive to advocate for my interests and maintain family balance. By the time Michael's graduation ceremony approached in May 2024, I had spent over 2 years gradually accepting reduced involvement in family decisions and events, assuming that the changes were temporary adjustments to my grief rather than permanent alterations to my role in David and Michael's lives. I had unknowingly allowed Rebecca to position herself as the primary coordinator and decision-maker for family events, gradually ceding authority that I should have maintained, while convincing myself that her increased control was helpful rather than harmful to family relationships. The woman who had built Walsh Pharmaceuticals by recognizing patterns of behavior that others missed, who had successfully identified and countered competitive threats before they could damage her business, who had spent decades developing strategic thinking that allowed her to anticipate and prepare for challenges, had somehow failed to recognize that she was being systematically marginalized by someone who was supposed to love and support her. The graduation ceremony seating debacle wasn't an isolated incident or a simple misunderstanding. It was the culmination of over 2 years of systematic manipulation designed to reduce my status within the family while positioning Rebecca as the central authority over decisions that should have involved input from everyone who loved and cared about Michael. But Rebecca had made one crucial miscalculation in her carefully orchestrated campaign to marginalize me. She had assumed that grief and age had permanently diminished my capabilities and influence, never suspecting that the woman she was manipulating retained the strategic thinking and institutional relationships that had made Walsh Pharmaceuticals successful. The vulnerability that Rebecca thought she could exploit indefinitely was about to collide with the reality of exactly who she had been underestimating for the past 2.5 years. What Rebecca didn't realize as she systematically worked to marginalize me from Michael's life was that my response to grief and isolation hadn't been withdrawal or surrender. It had been an increasingly generous investment in my grandson's future that would ultimately total over $400,000 in direct contributions to his education, living expenses, and opportunities that his parents either couldn't or wouldn't provide. The woman Rebecca thought she had successfully sidelined had actually become Michael's secret benefactor, quietly ensuring that her grandson would have every possible advantage while his parents remained oblivious to the scope of my financial support and emotional investment. The pattern of my increased involvement in Michael's life, and Rebecca's escalating efforts to limit and control that involvement, began during the summer of 2022, about 8 months after James's death, when Michael was preparing to start his junior year at Princeton. What should have been a celebration of his academic achievements and a planning period for his final years of college instead became a series of increasingly tense family discussions about money, expectations, and who had the authority to make decisions about Michael's education and future. The financial pressures that had driven David away from environmental law and into corporate practice had not disappeared when he joined Harrison, Caldwell, and Associates. If anything, Rebecca's lifestyle expectations had expanded to match David's increased income, creating a situation where their family expenses consistently consumed almost everything he earned, leaving little capacity for the kind of major educational investments that Michael's Princeton experience required. Princeton University's total cost of attendance in 2022, including tuition, room and board, books, and personal expenses, exceeded $80,000 per year. While David's corporate law salary was substantial, the combination of their mortgage payments, private school tuition for Michael's younger sister Emma, Rebecca's shopping and entertainment expenses, and their elaborate vacation and social commitments meant that even $80,000 per year represented a significant financial strain. The conversation that revealed the extent of their financial pressures and created the opportunity for my increased involvement in Michael's education happened during a family dinner at their house in Westfield in June 2022, when Michael was home for summer break and excited to tell us about his plans for his remaining years at Princeton. "Grandma Ellie, I've been talking to my professors about graduate school possibilities," Michael said, his face lighting up with the enthusiasm that always reminded me of David at the same age. "Dr. Rodriguez thinks I should consider applying to PhD programs in biomedical engineering especially programs that focus on developing assistive technologies for people with disabilities. Michael's academic interests had evolved during his Princeton years from general engineering toward the specific goal of using his technical skills to create devices and systems that could improve the lives of people with physical limitations, prosthetic, limbs with enhanced functionality, mobility aids that could adapt to different environments, communication devices for people with speech or hearing impairments. That sounds wonderful, Michael, I said, genuinely excited about his passion for work that would make meaningful contributions to people's lives. What kind of preparation do you need to do to be competitive for those PhD programs? Well, that's where things get complicated, Michael replied, his enthusiasm tempered by obvious concern about practical constraints. The best preparation would be to do independent research during my senior year, maybe even extend my undergraduate program by a semester to complete a really substantial research project. But that would mean additional tuition costs and living expenses that might not be financially realistic. I glanced at David and Rebecca, expecting them to reassure Michael that they would find ways to support whatever educational path would best prepare him for graduate school and his chosen career. Instead, I saw expressions that suggested this conversation had already happened privately and that the conclusion had not been encouraging. Michael, you know your father and I want to support your educational goals, Rebecca said, her tone carrying the kind of careful reasonableness that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. But we also have to be realistic about our families' financial resources and make sure we're making responsible decisions about educational investments. Responsible decisions about educational investments. Rebecca was suggesting that supporting Michael's research interests and graduate school preparation might be financially irresponsible, despite the fact that David's income placed their family in the top 5% of American households. Mom, I understand the financial constraints, Michael said, his disappointment obvious despite his effort to sound mature and accommodating. I could probably do research during the summer instead of extending my undergraduate program, and I could apply for research assistant positions that might help offset some of the costs. Research assistant positions that typically paid $12 to $15 per hour for work that required the kind of advanced technical skills that Michael was developing. Essentially minimum wage for highly specialized work that would provide excellent preparation for graduate school, but almost no financial benefit. Michael, have you looked into scholarship opportunities or research grants that might support this kind of independent project? David asked, clearly hoping to find solutions that wouldn't require additional family financial contributions. There are some possibilities, but most of the competitive scholarships and grants for undergraduate research are awarded based on financial need, and our family income is too high to qualify, Michael explained. The merit-based opportunities are extremely competitive, and they typically require research experience that I haven't had the chance to develop yet. The circular problem was obvious to everyone at the table. Michael needed research experience to be competitive for the scholarships and grants that would fund research opportunities, but he couldn't afford to do research without funding, and his family's income was too high to qualify for need-based support, but not high enough to comfortably fund the educational investments that would maximize his opportunities. As I listened to this conversation, I felt a familiar combination of frustration and determination that reminded me of my early years building Walsh Pharmaceuticals. Michael was describing exactly the kind of situation where family financial resources should be used to create opportunities for the next generation, supporting educational and career development that would pay dividends for decades to come. More importantly, I was watching my grandson, a brilliant, hard-working young man with genuine passion for using his skills to help people, potentially compromise his educational goals because his parents had prioritized lifestyle expenses over investments in his future. Michael, what would it cost to extend your undergraduate program by one semester and complete the kind of research project that would strengthen your graduate school applications? I asked. Michael consulted some notes that he had obviously prepared for this conversation. One additional semester of tuition and living expenses would be about $45,000, plus probably another $10,000 for research materials and conference travel to present the results. So roughly $55,000 total. $55,000 to provide Michael with research experience that could determine whether he was accepted to top-tier PhD programs and ultimately whether he could pursue the career he was passionate about. For a family with David and Rebecca's income, $55,000 should have been a manageable investment in their son's future, especially considering the amount they spent annually on luxury vacations, designer clothes, and entertainment. But Rebecca's expression made it clear that she viewed $55,000 as an unreasonable expense that would require unacceptable sacrifices to their current lifestyle. Michael, $55,000 is a very substantial amount of money, she said. We would have to make some significant adjustments to our family budget to accommodate that kind of expense, and we need to consider whether that investment is the most effective use of our resources. Most effective use of resources, as if investing in Michael's education was competing with other important family priorities rather than representing exactly the kind of opportunity that financial resources should be used to support. Rebecca, what kind of adjustments would be required? I asked, genuinely curious about what expenses would need to be reduced to fund Michael's research opportunity. Rebecca consulted her phone, apparently referring to budget information that she had prepared for this conversation. We would probably need to scale back our vacation plans for the next year, reduce our entertainment and dining expenses, and possibly delay some home improvement projects that we've been planning. Scale back vacation plans, reduce entertainment expenses, and delay home improvements. Rebecca was suggesting that Michael should compromise his educational goals rather than her family reducing their discretionary spending for a single year. That's when I made the decision that would fundamentally alter my relationship with Michael and ultimately create the conditions that would lead to the graduation ceremony humiliation. Michael, I would be happy to provide the $55,000 needed to support your research project and extend your undergraduate program, I said. Your education and career preparation are exactly the kind of investments that family resources should be used to support. The silence that followed my offer was profound and revealing. Michael looked stunned and grateful. David looked relieved, but also somewhat embarrassed that his mother was offering to provide financial support that he should have been able to offer himself. Rebecca looked distinctly uncomfortable, as if my generosity was creating complications rather than solving problems. Grandma Ellie, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't ask you to make that kind of financial sacrifice, Michael said, though his expression suggested that he very much wanted to accept the offer. Michael, you're not asking. I'm offering, I replied. And it's not a sacrifice. I have the resources to support your education, and ensuring that you have every possible opportunity to pursue your goals is one of the most meaningful ways I can use those resources. Eleanor, we appreciate the offer, but David and I need to discuss whether accepting that kind of financial support is the right decision for our family, Rebecca said, her tone carrying an edge that suggested my generosity was somehow problematic, rather than helpful. Whether accepting financial support was the right decision for their family, as if there were compelling reasons why Michael should compromise his educational goals, rather than accept assistance from his grandmother, who had the resources to provide it and wanted nothing more than to see him succeed. But David, perhaps, recognizing that Rebecca's concerns were more about control than finances, spoke up before she could elaborate on her objections. Mom, if you're serious about this offer, it would make an enormous difference for Michael's graduate school preparation, he said. We accept, and we're incredibly grateful for your support. Michael's face lit up with a combination of relief and excitement that made my decision feel like one of the best financial investments I had ever made. Grandma Ellie, thank you so much. This opportunity is going to change everything about my preparation for graduate school and my career possibilities. But I could see from Rebecca's expression that my financial support for Michael's education was creating exactly the kind of family dynamic that she had been working to avoid since James's death. Increased involvement from me in major family decisions and direct relationships between Michael and me that didn't require her coordination or approval. Over the following months, as Michael began planning his extended undergraduate research project, I became increasingly involved in his academic and career development in ways that bypassed Rebecca's efforts to manage and limit my influence. Michael called me regularly to discuss his research progress, asked for advice about graduate school applications, and included me in decisions about conference presentations and academic opportunities. More importantly, I discovered that Michael's financial needs extended far beyond the research project funding. Princeton's high cost of living, combined with textbook expenses, technology requirements, and social activities that were essential for networking and professional development, created ongoing financial pressures that David and Rebecca were either unable or unwilling to address. Rather than ask his parents for additional support that might require them to reduce their lifestyle expenses, Michael had been working 20 hours per week at the campus library, taking out student loans to cover living expenses and skipping social and professional activities that he couldn't afford. When I learned that Michael was compromising his academic performance and social development because of financial constraints that I could easily address, I made the decision to provide comprehensive support for all of his Princeton-related expenses. Michael, I want you to quit your library job and focus entirely on your studies and research, I told him during one of our phone conversations. I'll provide a monthly allowance that covers all of your living expenses, textbooks, technology needs, and social activities. Your only job should be getting the best possible education and preparing for graduate school. The monthly allowance I established for Michael was $3,500, enough to cover his apartment rent, meal plans, books, technology, clothing, and entertainment, without requiring him to work or take out additional student loans. Over the course of his final 2 years at Princeton, this support would total approximately $84,000, bringing my total investment in Michael's education to nearly $140,000. But more than the financial support, I began developing a close mentoring relationship with Michael that reminded me of the conversations I had shared with David during his college and law school years. Michael was genuinely interested in my experiences building Walsh Pharmaceuticals, asked thoughtful questions about entrepreneurship and innovation in healthcare, and seemed to appreciate the lessons I had learned about using professional success to create opportunities for others. Grandma Ellie, I've been thinking about our conversation about patent law and innovation incentives, Michael said during one of our weekly phone calls. Do you think there are ways to structure patent protections that would encourage innovation in assistive technologies while ensuring that people with disabilities can afford the devices they need? These conversations were intellectually stimulating and emotionally rewarding in ways that I hadn't experienced since James's death. Michael's questions and insights reminded me that my knowledge and experience remained valuable and relevant, even as I navigated the challenges of aging and widowhood. But my increased involvement in Michael's life and my direct financial support for his education created exactly the kind of independent relationship that Rebecca had been working to prevent. Michael was now calling me regularly, asking for my advice on important decisions, and developing personal and professional connections with me that didn't require Rebecca's coordination or approval. Rebecca's response to this development was to escalate her efforts to limit and control my involvement in family activities and decisions. The tactics she employed were subtle but systematic, designed to reduce my access to Michael and my influence over family events, while maintaining the appearance of normal family relationships. The first sign of Rebecca's increased efforts to marginalize me came during the planning for Michael's 21st birthday celebration in August 2022. What should have been a simple family gathering became a complex negotiation about guest lists, locations, timing, and the scope of my involvement in organizing and hosting the event. Eleanor, I know you want to be involved in Michael's birthday celebration, But we've decided to keep it small and simple this year, Rebecca told me during a phone call about party planning. Just immediate family and a few of Michael's closest friends. We thought we'd have a casual barbecue at our house rather than anything elaborate. Small and simple meant a guest list that would be carefully controlled by Rebecca, a location where she would be the host and primary organizer, and a format that would minimize opportunities for me to demonstrate my close relationship with Michael, or my generous support for his education. Rebecca, I'd be happy to help with organizing the party or hosting it at my apartment if that would be more convenient, I offered. I have space for a larger group, and I could arrange catering that would be more elegant than a backyard barbecue. That's very generous, Eleanor, but we really want to keep this celebration low-key and family-focused, Rebecca replied. Michael is at an age where he probably prefers casual gatherings with friends rather than formal events with extended family. Extended family. Rebecca had repositioned me from Michael's grandmother and primary financial supporter to extended family, whose presence might not be welcome at his birthday celebration. But more problematic than the party planning restrictions was Rebecca's systematic effort to limit my direct communication with Michael. She began intercepting my phone calls, claiming that Michael was too busy with studies to talk, but that she would be happy to pass along messages. She suggested that my weekly calls were creating additional stress for Michael during demanding academic periods and that I should coordinate with her before contacting him directly. Eleanor, I know you enjoy your conversations with Michael, but he's under a lot of pressure this semester with his research project and graduate school applications, Rebecca explained during one of many similar conversations. Maybe we could set up regular monthly calls so that he knows when to expect to hear from you and can plan accordingly. Regular monthly calls instead of weekly conversations, a 75% reduction in my contact with Michael, justified as consideration for his academic schedule, rather than acknowledged as an effort to limit our relationship. Most concerning of all, Rebecca began suggesting that my financial support for Michael was creating dependency issues that might be harmful to his personal development and character. Eleanor, David, and I have been discussing your generous support for Michael's education, and we're concerned that providing him with such extensive financial assistance might prevent him from developing the kind of independence and work ethic that will serve him well in graduate school and his career, she said during a conversation that felt more like an intervention than a family discussion. Rebecca, Michael is working extremely hard on his research and academic preparation, I replied. The financial support simply allows him to focus on education rather than spending 20 hours per week on minimum wage work that doesn't contribute to his career development. We understand your good intentions, but we think it would be better for Michael to learn to manage financial constraints and work-life balance rather than having all of his expenses covered by family support, Rebecca continued. We're worried that he might not be prepared for the financial realities of graduate school and early career challenges if he becomes accustomed to this level of financial assistance. The irony of Rebecca's lecture about financial responsibility and work ethic was breathtaking. This was a woman who had never worked a minimum wage job, who had convinced her husband to abandon his idealistic career goals to fund her luxury lifestyle, and who was now suggesting that my grandson should struggle financially to build character while she enjoyed designer clothes and European vacations. But more than irony, Rebecca's arguments revealed her true concern. My financial support for Michael was creating a direct relationship between us that didn't require her permission or involvement, and my influence over his opportunities and decisions was growing stronger rather than weaker as she had planned. The escalation of Rebecca's control efforts reached a new level during the spring of 2023, when Michael was applying to graduate schools and preparing to present his research at academic conferences. This should have been a period of celebration and family support as Michael achieved the academic success that my financial investment had made possible. Instead, it became a series of conflicts about my involvement in his achievements and my plans to attend his presentations and graduate school visits. Eleanor, I know you're excited about Michael's conference presentation at MIT, but we think it would be better if just David and I attend, Rebecca told me when I asked about travel arrangements for the conference where Michael would be presenting his research to potential graduate school advisors. Rebecca, I would very much like to see Michael present the research that I helped fund, I said. This is exactly the kind of academic achievement that I was hoping to support when I invested in his extended undergraduate program. We understand your interest, but we're concerned that having multiple family members at the conference might create additional pressure for Michael or distract from his professional networking opportunities, Rebecca replied. Academic conferences are really about building relationships with professors and researchers, not family celebrations. Family celebrations. Rebecca was repositioning Michael's academic achievements as professional events where my presence would be inappropriate rather than personal accomplishments where my support and attendance would be meaningful and appreciated. But the most revealing aspect of Rebecca's escalating control efforts was her systematic attempt to rewrite the narrative of Michael's academic success. In conversations with friends, family members, and academic contacts, Rebecca began describing Michael's achievements as the result of his parents' support and guidance, while minimizing or completely omitting my financial contributions and mentoring involvement. We're so proud of Michael's research success, I heard Rebecca telling a family friend during a social gathering. David and I have worked hard to provide him with every possible educational opportunity, and it's wonderful to see him taking advantage of the foundation we've built for him. David and I have worked hard to provide educational opportunities. Rebecca was claiming credit for investments that I had made while positioning herself and David as the primary architects of Michael's academic success. When I attempted to correct these misrepresentations by mentioning my support for Michael's research project, Rebecca's response was swift and revealing. Eleanor, we're very grateful for your financial contribution to Michael's education, but I think it's important not to create the impression that his success is dependent on external support, rather than his own hard work and our family's educational values, she said. External support. My investments in Michael's education had been reclassified as external support rather than family generosity, and my desire to receive appropriate recognition for those contributions was being framed as inappropriate self-promotion. By the time Michael's graduation ceremony approached in May 2024, I had invested over $400,000 in his education, living expenses, research opportunities, and conference presentations. I had developed a close mentoring relationship with him that had enriched both of our lives and had helped him achieve academic success that positioned him for acceptance to top-tier PhD programs. But Rebecca had successfully positioned herself as the primary coordinator for his graduation celebration, the central authority over family seating and logistics, and the person who would control my access to and involvement in what should have been one of the proudest moments of my life as Michael's grandmother and primary benefactor. The woman who had quietly ensured that Michael could pursue his academic dreams without financial constraints was being systematically excluded from recognition and involvement in his achievements by a daughter-in-law who viewed my generosity as a threat to her control rather than a gift to be appreciated. The graduation ceremony seating arrangement wasn't just about physical comfort or social status. It was the culmination of 2 years of escalating efforts to marginalize me from the family I had invested in financially and emotionally, while positioning Rebecca as the central figure in Michael's success story. But Rebecca had made one crucial miscalculation in her campaign to limit my influence and recognition. She had assumed that my financial generosity and emotional investment would continue regardless of how I was treated, never suspecting that there might be consequences for systematically disrespecting and excluding the person who had made Michael's opportunities possible. The woman who had built Walsh Pharmaceuticals by recognizing when business relationships had become exploitative rather than mutually beneficial was about to apply those same analytical skills to family dynamics that had become unsustainable. The grandmother who had been relegated to a folding chair next to the coffee station was about to remind everyone exactly what happened when you mistake generosity for weakness and confuse love with unlimited tolerance for disrespectful treatment. As I sat in folding chair G47 next to the coffee station, watching my family enjoy the reserved seating in the auditorium I had built, while university staff dismissed my contractual rights as the complaints of a confused elderly woman, I realized that this moment represented far more than a seating dispute or family disagreement. This was the culmination of 2.5 years of systematic exploitation, disrespect, and calculated marginalization by people who had mistaken my grief for permanent weakness and my generosity for unlimited tolerance. But what Rebecca Morrison and Princeton University's event staff were about to discover was that the woman they thought they could shuffle aside had spent the past 18 months quietly documenting every slight, every broken promise, and every instance of institutional amnesia that had led to this moment. The strategic thinking that had built Walsh Pharmaceuticals into a $2.8 billion company was about to be applied to delivering consequences that would be both immediate and lasting, public and personal, financially devastating and professionally humiliating. The phone call to Dean Patricia Whitmore that I initiated from my seat beside the catering station would prove to be the first domino in a chain of events that would transform Michael's graduation ceremony from a family celebration into a very public lesson about respect, recognition, and the catastrophic consequences of underestimating someone based on age and apparent powerlessness. Patricia, I need you to understand that this isn't just about seating arrangements, I said, keeping my voice calm despite the fury building inside me. What's happening here represents a complete breakdown of institutional memory about major right, donor relationships, and a systematic violation of legally binding agreements that Princeton University has made with one of its most significant benefactors. Eleanor, I want you to know that I take this extremely seriously, Patricia replied, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that suggested immediate and decisive action was forthcoming. The seating provisions in your donation agreement aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're contractual obligations that cannot be overridden by event staff or family members, regardless of their reasons. Patricia, I've been marginalized and dismissed by people who either don't know or don't care about my contributions to this institution, I continued. Your event coordinator just told me that university policy prioritizes immediate family members over extended family members, apparently unaware that I'm a member of Princeton's Board of Trustees and that my total contributions to this university exceed $23 million. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. Eleanor, are you telling me that Jennifer Martinez treated a sitting Board of Trustees member like a difficult elderly relative who was making unreasonable demands about seating? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Patricia, it gets worse. My daughter-in-law submitted seating arrangements that exclude me from the reserved section while claiming authority to override donor agreements. She's positioned herself as the primary family contact while systematically working to marginalize my involvement in my grandson's academic achievements that I've supported with over $400,000 in direct financial contributions. Eleanor, this is absolutely unacceptable on multiple levels, Patricia said, her voice now carrying the tone of someone who was preparing to deliver serious consequences to multiple people. You're describing not just a violation of donor agreements, but a complete failure of institutional respect and professional competence by our event staff. Patricia, I need you to understand that I'm not calling to complain or seek sympathy, I said. I'm calling to inform you that Princeton University is about to face a choice. Honor your contractual commitments and institutional obligations to major donors, or accept the consequences of systematic disrespect and broken agreements. What kind of consequences are we talking about, Eleanor? I had spent the 18 months since Rebecca's marginalization campaign began thinking about this exact question. How do you respond to systematic disrespect from people who are supposed to love and support you? How do you address institutional amnesia from organizations that have benefited enormously from your generosity? How do you deliver consequences that are both proportional to the offense and effective in preventing future similar treatment? Patricia, I want you to stop the graduation ceremony and reorganize the seating to comply with my donation agreement, I said. I want Jennifer Martinez and whoever authorized her to override donor commitments removed from their positions. And I want a public acknowledgement that Princeton University failed to honor its obligations to a major donor and Board of Trustees member. Eleanor, I have the authority to halt the ceremony and reorganize seating immediately, Patricia confirmed. But are you sure you want to take that approach? It will create a very public spectacle and potentially overshadow Michael's graduation experience. Patricia, my grandson's graduation has already been overshadowed by my systematic exclusion from recognition and involvement, I replied. Michael deserves to see his grandmother treated with the respect and dignity that my contributions to his education and this institution have earned. More importantly, the people who have been exploiting my generosity and disrespecting my commitments need to face consequences that are proportional to their behavior. I'll make the calls immediately, Patricia said. Eleanor, I want you to know that this situation is completely contrary to Princeton's values and our commitment to honoring the donors and trustees who make our mission possible. What's happened today will have serious consequences for everyone involved. As I hung up the phone, I noticed that Rebecca was making her way over to my seating area, apparently having noticed my extended phone conversation and wondering whether I was causing additional difficulties that would require her management and damage control. Eleanor, I hope you're not creating problems about the seating arrangements, she said, her tone carrying the kind of patronizing concern typically used with elderly relatives who might embarrass themselves through inappropriate behavior. The ceremony is about to begin, and it would really be better for everyone if we could just focus on celebrating Michael's achievement. Just focus on celebrating Michael's achievement, as if my desire to receive appropriate recognition for the $400,000 I had invested in making his achievement possible was somehow detracting from rather than enhancing the celebration. Rebecca, I think you're about to discover that there are consequences for systematically disrespecting major donors and violating contractual agreements, I said calmly. You might want to return to your seat and prepare for some changes to the ceremony logistics. Rebecca's expression shifted from patronizing concern to genuine confusion. What are you talking about, Eleanor? What changes? Before I could respond, the auditorium's sound system crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything about Michael's graduation ceremony and our family's understanding of exactly who held the real power in this situation. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to pause the graduation ceremony for a few minutes to address some logistical issues with our seating arrangements, came the voice of Dr. Andrew Morrison, Princeton's president, who had apparently been briefed on the situation and was now personally managing the crisis. We apologize for any inconvenience and appreciate your patience as we resolve these matters. The auditorium, which had been filled with the excited chatter of families preparing to watch their graduates receive diplomas, fell into confused silence. 2,400 people who had gathered to celebrate academic achievement were now witnessing what appeared to be an unprecedented disruption of Princeton University's most important annual ceremony. He watched Rebecca's face transform, from confusion to alarm as she began to understand that my phone call had somehow triggered institutional responses that were far beyond anything she had anticipated or prepared for. Eleanor, what did you do? She asked, her voice rising with panic, as she realized that the situation was spiraling beyond her ability to manage or control. I called the dean and informed her that Princeton University was violating contractual agreements with a major donor and Board of Trustees member, I replied. I also explained that my family had systematically marginalized me from my grandson's academic achievements, despite my $400,000 investment in his education. Rebecca's face went white as the implications of what I was saying began to register. You're on the Board of Trustees? You donated money to build this auditorium? Rebecca, I'm Eleanor Catherine Walsh. I built Walsh Pharmaceuticals from nothing into a $2.8 billion company. I've donated over $23 million to Princeton University. I'm a sitting member of the Board of Trustees, and for the past 2.5 years you've been systematically working to marginalize and exclude me from family decisions while positioning yourself as the primary coordinator for events and celebrations. The color drained from Rebecca's face completely as she began to understand the scope of her miscalculation. The elderly woman she had been dismissing and managing as an inconvenient family burden was actually one of the most powerful and influential people associated with Princeton University. I didn't know, Rebecca stammered, but she was interrupted by the arrival of a Princeton security officer who was clearly looking for someone specific. "Mrs. Walsh?" the officer said, approaching. "My folding chair with the kind of respectful deference typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. Dean Whitmore has asked me to escort you to the Walsh family reserved seating section. She also asked me to inform you that President Morrison would like to speak with you personally before the ceremony resumes." Walsh family reserved seating section. The officer was referring to the front 2 rows of the auditorium by their official designation, making it clear that these seats were specifically allocated to my family and could not be reassigned by event coordinators or daughters-in-law. "Thank you, officer," I said, rising from my folding chair and gathering my purse with the dignity of someone who had never doubted that this moment would eventually arrive. "I'll be happy to speak with President Morrison." As the security officer escorted me toward the front of the auditorium, I was aware that 2,400 people were watching this unprecedented procession and wondering what kind of crisis had required the university president to personally intervene in graduation ceremony logistics. But more satisfying than the public attention was Rebecca's expression as she watched the woman she had relegated to a folding chair by the coffee station being treated with the kind of institutional respect typically reserved for heads of state or Nobel Prize winners. The conversation with President Morrison took place in a small office adjacent to the auditorium, where he was waiting with Dean Whitmore and 2 other university administrators who appeared to be taking notes for what was clearly being treated as a serious institutional crisis. "Mrs. Walsh, on behalf of Princeton University, I want to offer my personal apology for the completely unacceptable treatment you received from our event staff today," President Morrison began. "The failure to honor your donation agreement and the disrespectful manner in which you were treated represent a serious breach of our institutional values and our commitments to the donors and trustees who make our mission possible. President Morrison, I appreciate your apology, but I want you to understand that this situation extends beyond individual staff failures," I replied. "What happened today reflects systematic institutional amnesia about donor relationships and a breakdown in communication that allowed university employees to override legally binding agreements. Mrs. Walsh, we take full responsibility for these failures," Dean Whitmore interjected. "Jennifer Martinez has been suspended pending a full investigation of how she was authorized to override donor seating agreements. The event coordinator who approved these arrangements has been terminated immediately." Suspended and terminated. 2 Princeton employees had lost their jobs within 30 minutes of my phone call, demonstrating that the consequences of disrespecting major donors were swift and severe. "More importantly," President Morrison continued, "we want to ensure that this kind of institutional failure never happens again. We're implementing new protocols for donor recognition and event coordination that will prevent any family member or event staff from overriding contractual commitments to major benefactors. President Morrison, while I appreciate these administrative changes, I also want to address the public nature of what happened today," I said. 2,400 people witnessed Princeton University failing to honor its commitments to a major donor. I think the resolution of this situation should be equally public. "What do you have in mind, Mrs. Walsh?" "I want you to announce to the audience that the ceremony was delayed because university staff failed to provide appropriate seating for Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, member of the Board of Trustees and the donor who funded the construction of this auditorium," I said. "I want public recognition of my contributions to this institution and acknowledgement that the initial seating arrangements were inappropriate and have been corrected." President Morrison exchanged glances with Dean Whitmore before nodding his agreement. Mrs. Walsh, that's completely appropriate. You deserve public recognition for your contributions to Princeton, and the audience deserves an explanation for the ceremony delay. When we returned to the auditorium, I was escorted to the center seat in the front row, the prime location in the Walsh family reserved seating section, while Rebecca, David, and the rest of the family were repositioned around me according to the original seating hierarchy specified in my donation agreement. The look on Rebecca's face as she was moved from the center front seat to a side position in the second row was a perfect reflection of how quickly and dramatically power dynamics could shift when people finally understood who they had been dealing with. But the most satisfying moment came when President Morrison took the stage to address the audience before the ceremony resumed. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for the delay in today's ceremony, which was necessary to correct a serious error in our seating arrangements, he announced to the packed auditorium. Due to a failure in our event coordination protocols, we initially failed to provide appropriate seating for Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, a distinguished member of Princeton's Board of Trustees and the generous donor who funded the construction of this beautiful auditorium where we gather today. A murmur of recognition and appreciation rippled through the audience as 2,400 people turned to look at me sitting in the front row, finally receiving the public acknowledgement that my contributions to Princeton and Michael's education had earned. Mrs. Walsh's extraordinary generosity has made countless educational opportunities possible for Princeton students, and her support exemplifies the kind of philanthropic leadership that enables our university to fulfill its mission of service to society. President Morrison continued. We are grateful for her contributions and honored by her presence at today's ceremony. The sustained applause that followed was deeply gratifying, but more meaningful was the expression on Michael's face as he sat with the other graduates and finally understood the scope of his grandmother's influence and the depth of her investment in his success. When Michael's name was called and he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction that went far beyond the restoration of my proper seating. I was watching my grandson achieve academic excellence that had been made possible by my financial support in an auditorium that I had built, while receiving the public recognition that my contributions deserved. But the consequences of the day's events extended far beyond the graduation ceremony itself. Within a week of Michael's graduation, Rebecca called to request a private meeting where she could clear the air about the misunderstandings that had led to the seating controversy. What she discovered during that conversation was that I had spent the past 18 months documenting every instance of marginalization, every broken promise, and every attempt to minimize my involvement in Michael's life and achievements. Eleanor, I want you to know that I never intended to minimize your contributions to Michael's education or exclude you from family celebrations, Rebecca said during a conversation that felt more like a legal deposition than a family discussion. I think there may have been some miscommunications about family coordination and event planning. Rebecca, I have detailed records of every conversation where you repositioned me as extended family, every attempt to limit my contact with Michael, and every effort to claim credit for achievements that my financial support made possible, I replied. This wasn't miscommunication. It was systematic exploitation designed to marginalize my influence while benefiting from my generosity. What do you want from me, Eleanor? I want acknowledgement that you systematically worked to exclude me from Michael's life while accepting $400,000 in financial support for his education. I want assurance that my relationship with Michael will no longer be subject to your management and control. And I want recognition that my contributions to his success deserve respect rather than minimization. The agreement we reached included several provisions that would reshape our family dynamics permanently. Rebecca would no longer serve as the primary coordinator for family events involving Michael. My financial contributions to Michael's education would be acknowledged publicly and privately. Most importantly, my relationship with Michael would be direct and independent, without requiring Rebecca's approval or coordination. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was the change in how other family members and university associates understood my position and influence. The graduation ceremony had demonstrated publicly that Eleanor Walsh was not a peripheral elderly relative who could be dismissed and managed, but a central figure whose contributions demanded respect and recognition. Michael, who had been largely unaware of the family dynamics that had been developing around his education and achievements, was both grateful and horrified when he learned the full scope of what had been happening. "Grandma Ellie, I had no idea that Mom was limiting your involvement in my life or trying to minimize your support for my education," he said during one of our first unrestricted conversations after graduation. "Everything I've achieved at Princeton has been possible because of your generosity, and I want to make sure you receive the recognition and appreciation you deserve." The relationship that I developed with Michael during his graduate school years at MIT, where he was accepted to a top-tier PhD program in biomedical engineering, became one of the most rewarding aspects of my later life. Free from Rebecca's management and control, we were able to build the kind of mentoring relationship that I had always hoped to have with my grandson. Michael's doctoral research, which focused on developing advanced prosthetic limbs with enhanced sensory feedback, was directly inspired by our conversations about using professional success to create opportunities for people with fewer advantages. The $150,000 I contributed to support his graduate research resulted in innovations that would eventually help thousands of amputees regain functionality and independence. But beyond the personal satisfaction of watching Michael succeed academically and professionally, the graduation ceremony incident had demonstrated something important about respect, recognition, and the consequences of underestimating people based on age or apparent vulnerability. The woman who had been relegated to folding chair G47 next to the coffee station had reminded everyone that institutional power, financial influence, and strategic thinking don't disappear when someone becomes elderly or experiences personal loss. If anything, decades of experience in building relationships and accumulating influence make such people more formidable opponents when they decide that disrespectful treatment has gone too far. Rebecca Morrison learned that exploiting someone's grief and isolation while benefiting from their generosity was not just morally wrong, it was strategically catastrophic when that person retained the capabilities and connections needed to deliver consequences that were both immediate and lasting. Princeton University learned that institutional amnesia about major donors could result in public embarrassment and administrative consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings or disappointed expectations. And Michael learned that his grandmother wasn't just a source of financial support, but a strategic thinker and accomplished leader whose experience and wisdom could provide guidance and inspiration for his own career and life choices. 6 months after the graduation ceremony, I received a letter from the Princeton Alumni Association asking if I would be willing to speak at their annual donor recognition dinner about my experiences as a female entrepreneur and my commitment to supporting educational opportunities for future generations. The invitation was addressed to the Honorable Eleanor C. Walsh, Board of Trustees, Walsh Pharmaceuticals founder, and distinguished Princeton benefactor. A far cry from the difficult elderly relative who had been shuttled off to sit next to the coffee station. As I prepared my remarks for that dinner, I reflected on the lessons that the graduation ceremony experience had taught me about respect, recognition, and the importance of never accepting treatment that diminishes your dignity, even when that treatment comes from people who are supposed to love and support you. The moral of this story isn't about money or revenge. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to allow others to marginalize your contributions, whether those contributions are financial, professional, or personal. It's about recognizing that age and grief don't eliminate your capabilities or diminish your right to be treated with respect. At 70 years old, I had learned that being called extended family by someone who had benefited from $400,000 in financial support was an opportunity to demonstrate that some family members are more central and influential than they appear. The next time someone tries to shuffle you aside or minimize your contributions, Remember that respect isn't something you request. It's something you command through the strength of your character and the power of your capabilities. And sometimes, the most effective way to restore proper recognition is to remind people exactly who they've been underestimating and what their miscalculation is going to cost them. The relic they thought they could ignore had provided a masterclass in strategic thinking, institutional influence, and the devastating consequences of mistaking generosity for weakness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.